Today, on this episode of whatever it is, focus issues, whatever else, I'm going to be talking about how do we, just everyday people, intervene in the process of genocide. How do we step in the path and keep this from happening? This is going to be hopefully a hands-on, what can you do to do the thing type conversation. So, like many times, we're going to shut off the comments and then we will break for conversation time. But before we get to that, if you appreciate the work that I do, my Cash App helps me with some basic everyday living expenses. It also, allows me to do something special every now and then, like go out to dinner, do something for the kids. My Venmo is for moving expenses. I live in the state of Arkansas right now. In 18 days, I will be moving to Minnesota. And so the expenses of moving and relocating into a totally different living environment are going to be quite considerable. So if you would like to help out with that, you can go to Venmo and you can leave something there. If you would like to go to my links page, you will find my GoFundMe, which will allow you to do something very similar. There are a number of different ways that you can connect with me on that page as well. And if you are able to contribute, I would appreciate that. Every little bit helps and assists, especially as I'm moving toward a situation where I don't have income at the moment, but for right now the expenses would be helpful. Also, I'm right now updating my links to include an Amazon wish list that would give me, or you, I should say, access to some of the things that I'm going to need for, moving into a new situation. I had some, things over there to, just have fun, a little bit of thing here and there. But instead, I've put my moving and relocation wish list up, so if you'd like to help with that, you can. Also within all my links are connections to all of my YouTube videos that I have been talking about the issue of genocide and how we are continuing to move forward through that. So if you'd like to see some of the other things that I've said about that or share, that would be amazing. And finally, if you do find this useful, if you find this conversation and the material that I bring useful to others, please share this information. It's the only way that it gets out there. I am not a huge creator. I am not, a big-time influencer. I am pretty much just here to do what I can to let people know this is what's happening in the world. And if you can share that with others and we spread that information, that would be extremely helpful. As of yesterday, the Amazon link wasn't working. I apologize for that, Vespers. I have changed that as of right now. So all I can say is try that again and see if it works. It popped up for me, so I don't know what's going on. So, all right. Let's get started. I have been talking for weeks now that there is a clearly defined genocidal event in process right now in the United States. I've talked about this. I have broken it down according to the definitions. I've broken it down by experts who have defined the process of genocide, and I've been making as much, open impact as I can for people to understand it. Now, in providing a very brief and quick rundown of the subject of genocide, according to the United Nations defines genocide in this way in a document that was prepared called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Article 2 lays out the definition of genocide this way. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Number 1, killing members of that group. Number 2, causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group. Number 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Number 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And number 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Based on what has been happening here in the United States, we can clearly see 3 of these 5 definitions that are occurring right now in the United States. The first one is number 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. When we look at the numbers from different surveys of members of the LGBTQ+ community, in particular members of the transgender community, both youth and adults, we see that the efforts of legislation over the last 3 years has increased the number of poor mental health responses, meaning that over the last 3 years, the surveys show an increase in the number of people within the transgender community who have a weaker understanding of their mental health. The ideas of we are being outlawed, we are being criminalized, the prevention of access to gender-affirming care as well as medical care, the increase in discrimination and in the presence of hostility that continues to grow against the transgender community. That has eroded the mental health of the transgender community. So, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the group. It is detailed in the statistics. We have seen that the number of people within the LGBTQ+ community who have thought about ending their own lives has increased drastically. So yes, this is definitely a case of an effort to cause mental harm. We know that this is intentional. We know this is intentional because we have people who sit before legislators and tell them that this is doing this. We know that this is intentional because we bring the statistics that show it. We know that this is intentional because there are members of the community and families within the community that sit in front of these people and tell them this is their reality. And still, the march to legislate us out of existence and the increase in discrimination and hostility erodes our mental well-being. So, definition number 2 of the United Nations Code of what defines genocide has been achieved. Number 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. When we talk to legislators about what is happening, when we share with them what is happening in our lives and why these things do not need to be a part of the society of the United States, we make it very clear that these statistics are going to lead to increases in suicidality. It is going to increase in the number of people who will think about it, attempt it, and complete it. The perspective that is being promoted by this agenda of genocide toward transgender people has taken all of that into calculation. And they have determined that the potential numbers do not justify reversing their action. We've provided the numbers, and they have decided that if they can provide what they deem to be a better alternative, then the numbers will not be as severe. We've talked a lot about how conservatives and the far right have used a model of the past for what they want. They want to return to the 1950s. They want to return to what they look at as a golden age. And when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community and the transgender community, they want to return to a time when transgender people were not public. They want to return to a time when transgender people stayed hidden. And so their belief is that if we return to systems that were in place at that time, then obviously there won't be a problem with transgender people anymore because they will have gotten the help that they needed. That system that was in the past was conversion therapy, sometimes through involuntary institutionalization. We know that they are attempting to do this. We know that their language is moving in this direction because punitive psychiatry is the newest form of attack on transgender people. Punitive psychiatry is where diagnoses of mental illness, mental health concerns, are used to target groups of people in such a way so that you can use that mental health against them in a negative way. The numbers that we have provided to all of the legislations, the numbers that we have provided to all of those who are making these decisions, has been calculated as it won't be as bad as you think because we're going to finally give you the help that you're not getting right now. Definition number 3 of the United Nations has been met within the United States for a genocide. And definition number 5 is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Force is not necessarily by armed or physical means. Forcing a child from one group to another can also be legislative. It can be the use of political authority, governmental authority. In Texas, last year we saw Governor Greg Abbott completely subvert the legislative process and sent a mandate to the Department of Family and Children's Protective Services in the state of Texas, requiring that that department investigate families who had transgender children who were possibly receiving transgender care for child abuse. In those cases, of course, if child abuse is deemed as happening, that child would be removed from that family and placed within the child welfare system. In this case, parents who were affirming their transgender child and helping them gain access to gender-affirming care would have their children taken away from them, placed within the foster care system, and then have a child abuse charge that they had to deal with. In the state of Florida, there is a bill that is moving forward that would allow the state of Florida to remove a transgender child from an affirming parent within the state and place them as a ward of the state of Florida. This bill is so vague and it is so open-ended that it also looks to be interpreted as a cisgender child of a transgender child can be removed from that parent. And there are curious inquiries as to whether or not this applies to citizens of the state of Florida, meaning that if you have a family with a transgender child and you are traveling in Florida, there are examinations on this bill to see if it could potentially lead to the seizing of that child from someone who is not even a citizen of the state of Florida. In many other states, there are child abuse laws being amended to include gender-affirming care. Laws that are on the book that are supposed to protect children from child abuse are being amended with the definitions of gender-affirming care being applied. In essence, what they are saying is that any gender-affirming care will be designated as child abuse. Doctors are being criminalized if they do gender-affirming care. Parents can be charged with harm to a child for providing gender-affirming care. That means these children will be taken out of their families, placed within the state system. Definition number 5 of the United Nations definition of genocide has been reached here in the United States. 3 of 5 definitions recognized by the United Nations are being done right now in the United States when it comes to transgender people. The United Nations is responsible for watching things across the world, seeing when members of countries are in potential harm's way. The problem that we are having with the United Nations is that the definition states that the group that is being targeted is a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. This led to a piece that was written by a task force. One of the members of that task force and co-authors of this piece is Madeleine Albright. In this writing, they use this definition. To avoid the legalistic arguments that have repeatedly impeded timely and effective action, the task force has defined its scope in this report as the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities, meaning large-scale and deliberate attacks on civilians. The victims of genocide and mass atrocities are typically targeted because of their identification as members of a group. This new report looks to expand the understanding of genocide as not just the narrow definition of a national, ethnic, religious group, but includes any group within a population who are separated and placed out from the rest of the population. The LGBTQ+ community is being targeted by conservative far-right Christian nationalists, and transgender people are even being singled out among the LGBTQ+ community by members of the community as being other. There are those within the LGB part of the community who want nothing to do with transgender people any longer, and they want them removed from association. So as we begin to look at the 21st century definition of genocide, it is imperative that we understand that this definition of genocide is not just about a recognition of what nation or what ethnic group or racial group or religious group they are a part of. It can also be a group that is identified and then targeted for being othered and followed up on by the process of genocide. These 10 items right here have been defined and used by many people as understanding how genocide has come to pass. Dr. Gregory Stanton came up with these 10 items in the 1990s. It has now become very common to talk about the process that has been seen in many forms of genocide in the past. But by looking at all 10 of these in relationship to each other, we can begin to ask, is something happening right now that would designate a genocide occurring? When we look at these 10 processes, and we examine what is happening within the transgender community in the United States, we can clearly state that according to this process list, there is indeed a genocide happening. For those who may not be familiar with the list or the terms, classification is just the sense of creating an us versus them mentality. Creating an us versus them attitude of we're the right group, they're the wrong group. We're the in group, they're the out group, and we have the right to determine what happens to them. In the process of this, as we will see in just a little bit, there is the removal of rights of citizenship from this group. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Next is symbolization, creating some form of shorthand, creating some form of easier designation to identify this group of people. Classification and symbolization, these are universally human. It's something we all do. But when classification and symbolization are a means of saying, you are a different group from the rest of us, and therefore you are not wanted, you are an outsider, you don't deserve the same, then we see that we are moving into genocidal understanding of these two processes. For example, transgender people were identified in the late 1880s as a different group within homosexuality. Up until the 1920s, the identification of transgender people at that time, it would have been transvestite or transsexual, was very much a matter of the medical community, the scientific community began to separate those who were transgender identified away from those who were homosexual. Now, most of this research was being done in Berlin in the 1920s and early 1930s. And in 1934, the Nazi regime went in to the institute that was responsible for a lot of this research, burned most of the written material, and took those who were experts and placed them within concentration camps and prisons. We still have some of this information available to us today, and we can research it, but the vast majority of that research is now gone. So we had to start over. And in the 1950s, it began again. The process of understanding homosexuality and a trans-identified experience began again, and people began to notice a difference in that, which led to some of the early designations of transgender people as transsexual, but also a very negative word now, as we look back, autogynephiliac. This term was applied to transgender people, but it was based upon sexual orientation. We have since moved away from that understanding, and we have moved into understanding transgender as something separate from sexual orientation. That understanding of identity and self, it may connect at some point, but it is not necessarily related. So as we have continued to move through, transgender people have constantly been othered. But there was a very negative connotation of that othering in public. If you've not watched the documentary Disclosure, I recommend it. Because throughout history of media, transgender people have been either the butt of jokes, or the victim of something horrendous, or the worst of villains. Transgender people in media have typically never been identified as just like everybody else. In media, we do not see transgender people portrayed as just everyday persons living their lives. So the very image of a transgender person is symbol enough to create othering, because the mindset of people has been shaped to say, when you see a transgender person, they are not like us. Third, we have discrimination. Discrimination is the use of political power, law, customs, to deny rights to the group that has been othered. A dominant group, typically with an exclusionary ideology behind them, would do everything they can to influence the powers that be to remove access to rights to the group that has been identified. Right now we are looking at discrimination. We are looking at discrimination in the sense that there are 23 states in the United States that do not protect LGBTQ plus individuals from discrimination in employment, housing, education, financing, and medical care. Discrimination in the sense that bills are being written specifically for this population group, calling out transgender demographic as something that needs to be legislated. People have been able to notice that those who stand in opposition to transgender rights typically are very charismatic, very outspoken, very powerful in their message. And that discrimination continues to move forward. Dehumanization is number 4. In dehumanization, people of the targeted group are identified with something that is not human, equating people with animals, vermin, insects, disease, or as we see in most recent times, associating that othered group with another group that has been othered and is considered the worst of humanity: pedophiles and groomers. That is dehumanization language. That is the language of taking away one's humanity to bring you lower than. So when groups other transgender people by using, "You're just mentally ill," "This is a delusion," "You're just a bunch of pedophiles who want access to children," that is dehumanization, so that the group can find it easier. The dominant group can find it easier to act in more and more horrendous ways toward the othered group. We see it in print. We see it in video, social media. We see it, we hear it on radios. We watch it on Fox News and Newsmax, the Daily Wire. The propaganda is out there, and it's used to make transgender people look like villains. And as people are indoctrinated to incite some sort of behavior toward the othered group, they are told along the way that we would be better off without them in our society. We see them, but they are immoral. They are a drag on society. They are only corrupting who we are as a people, and therefore we would be better off without them. Organization. Organization is the work of different groups, or a large enough group, to shape the way things happen. Right now, within the United States, we know that there is an organization of groups, individual entities, or at least seemingly independent individual agencies, that are working in concert together to bring about legislation that criminalizes transgender people, to generate propaganda that talks about how horrible transgender people are. This organization is spread across policymakers, legal experts, and public profiles, people who are out in the public eye, as well as media platforms. So this group works together to spread the message, a very simple and very consistent message, that transgender people are not part of us. Polarization is trying to separate the other group from any potential supporters. For example, when we look at what's happening within the LGBTQ plus community, there is a group called LGB Alliance who is doing everything it can to say that transgender people are not a part of the queer community and that we need to be jettisoned. There was a movement on Twitter, hashtag LGB without the T. That was very much an effort to dislodge transgender people from lesbian, gay, and bisexual community. We also see this within certain feminist organizations doing everything they can to convince those who fight for the rights of women to distance themselves from transgender people. Transgender men are considered to be women who have been deluded into a different life, and transgender women are considered to be predators who dress up in a costume. You see, we see different groups that could be a huge support to us beginning to distance themselves. They begin to pull back and begin to claim the rhetoric of the organization that began the effort. Ask yourself this question: how do Christian identified churches, radical feminists, white supremacist groups, and gays all end up working for the same thing? That is polarization. That is the effort to other a group in such a way so that it is singled out and identified as a threat to every other organization or identity group. Preparation. This is where things like there is a transgender problem. We must eradicate transgenderism. They are subjecting themselves to harm and they don't realize it. They're not getting the help that they need. These phrases are very much a part of preparation in moving toward the action steps that we see here. Preparation creates in the minds of those who do not identify with the targeted group fear of the targeted group. If we don't protect ourselves, they are going to come after us. Transgender people are taking away our rights. Transgender women are culturally appropriating the identity of women. That's the language that we're using in preparation. All of these fall under the idea of, for some reason, transgender people are a threat to other groups. They're coming after your kids. They want to indoctrinate your kids. Keep it out of schools. Keep away from my kids. Why? Because we're a threat. Stay out of the bathrooms. Why? Because we're a threat. All of this language is a part of preparation for what comes next. It begins with persecution. Persecution are the early steps to take those who have been identified and begin to systematically diminish their population. We have already talked about one of the definitions of the United Nations being taking the children of transgender people away, or taking transgender children away from their affirming families. That's persecution. Making it a crime to use a bathroom, which then creates a sense of vigilantism where people can turn in a transgender person for being in the wrong space, is persecution. Bills that are written in such a vague way to say that if you are a transgender person and you are out in public where you could possibly encounter children and you are dressed in the clothing and the appearance of the opposite sex, you are therefore a threat and you must be eliminated through harassment, through arrest. That is persecution. Finally, when we look at persecution, we know that the movement of people from one location to another is a part of this. Right now, we have been watching voluntary relocation, meaning that in states where gender-affirming care has been banned, in states where public appearance could be criminalized for transgender people, in states where bathrooms are now off limits, without putting ourselves at risk, many of us have chosen to voluntarily relocate. We are moving to a different state because it is safer for us. But there will come a time when the conversation of removing the group to a place where they can get the help they need will become a dominant conversation. The party platform of the Texas GOP at the end of 2022 stated that transgender people in a very coded way said that transgender people who socially transition are committing a physical and a psychological harm to themselves, and that gender affirming care is only part of this process of harm. If transgender people are going to be relieved of their disorder, then they need the appropriate form of therapy. And under the GOP party platform, conversion therapy was the only viable alternative. The only one that would really do any good. We also know that it is possible for law enforcement to take somebody into custody if they are deemed to be a danger to themselves or others. It is not too far a step to see law enforcement being empowered to arrest transgender people and place them on a mental health hold and place them within an institution. It's been done before in the United States. We have a history of this. And it's not that far from taking place again. All of that is persecution. Extermination is where people typically go to when saying there's a genocide happening, that there are individuals who are being killed in mass numbers. Most genocides are only genocides in part. They are not actually the removal of an identified group. For example, the educated members, the leaders of a group, would be targeted first. Which, by the way, in the last month or so, we have had in the last 2 months, we have had 3 representatives silenced for asinine and hollow reasons, when the very reason that they were being silenced was that they were speaking on transgender rights. Representative Mauree Turner out of Oklahoma, Representative Zoe Zephyr out of Montana, and Senator Megan Hunt in Nebraska. All 3 have been silenced from speaking on transgender rights issues. Sometimes genocides, in part, are more of a disruption of something than they are a destruction of something. For example, after reporting on gender-affirming care being done in certain hospitals around the United States, multiple bomb threats were phoned in, which disrupted the provision of care, not just of transgender people, but of all people. This led to the removal of gender-affirming care in some of those hospitals. The Attorney General in the state of Missouri issued an emergency decision that would effectively bar any gender-affirming access for transgender people. Yes, the access would still be available, but the barriers to that and accessing that health were so insurmountable that it was practically impossible to achieve that care that was needed. You see, these are efforts. These are actions that are being taken right now that exist between persecution and extermination. Finally, we get to denial. Denial actually happens throughout the entirety. It happens when people say there is a genocide happening and others say no, there's not. It's when discrimination is obvious and people say your rights are not being denied, you're not losing your rights, you have the same right as everybody else. dehumanization when it happens, and people don't say, you can't say that because that's illegal to slander someone. That's illegal to write something in media that is not true. Denial exists at every step of the page. Organization, these groups say, we're not attacking trans people, we are looking out for the kids. By the same organizations that have in the past hidden sexual abuse by its members, by its leaders. One organization that comes to mind is the Family Council in Arkansas. Family Council is very much behind pushing anti-trans legislation in the Arkansas legislature. One of its members was Josh Duggar. If you're not familiar with who Josh Duggar is, I recommend you make a quick little search of him. But they deny any association with him now. They recognize that he was a part of their group, but they deny that he was a part of them, while at the same time saying that transgender people are a threat to children. So these are the 10 phases, processes of genocide. As we look at these, 9 of these are clearly in play right now in the United States with regard to the transgender community. Pairing this with United Nations definition, where 3 of the definitions exist, it is clear that there is a transgender genocide happening, and now we need to ask and act on what can we do. Before we do that, let's take a break and ask questions about the definition. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. What are the steps that can be taken to intervene and change the path that we are taking? Dr. Gregory Stanton in 2023 wrote a clarification of his 10 stages of genocide. This is what he says at the end of that. The movement that will end genocide must come not from international armed interventions, but rather from popular resistance to every form of discrimination, dehumanization, hate speech, formation of hate groups, rise of political parties that preach hatred, racism, or xenophobia, rule by polarizing elites that advocate exclusionary ideologies, police states that massively violate human rights, closure of borders to international trade or communications, and denial of past genocides or crimes against humanity against victim groups. So if we take that statement from Dr. Gregory Stanton and we slightly adapt that to what is happening right now, the first is very obvious. We must gather together a popular resistance that will actively resist every form of discrimination. This can be done in dehumanizing hate speech. This can be in calling out hate groups and demanding action in diminishing their influence. This is reviewing political parties and looking for those members who rise up to speak the loudest in such a way as to minimize, discriminate, and dehumanize transgender people. By calling out exclusionary ideologies and demanding that all people be included. And being open and honest that this is what is happening. People have to understand that this is taking place. People have to understand that this is a part of the fabric of our society right now in the United States. The hostility that is growing is not doing so independent of some form of organization and power that is enhancing that. So, how do we get into those steps? How do we move into that place of popular resistance? Well, first of all, get informed. Find out what is happening. This is not new. This is not something that is, in the past. This is something that is happening right now. This is taking place right now. Why is it happening? What is happening? How is it being implemented? I have been sitting in this place of informing people about this for a couple of months now. At least a few weeks, very loudly. But there are others who are talking about this. There are others who are noticing this. And they are making it clear why we are in the genocide we are in. The reason why transgender people are being targeted is because we represent a shift in worldviews. We represent a shift in what people considered to be normal. We represent a shift of the changing of time. We are something new for people to accept, and people hate the things that are new, the things that are alien, the things that are novel, especially when they change how they live. Become informed about this. Find out what the definitions mean. Find out what these process steps look like. Spend the time to find out. And then stand up. Stand up and say, look, this is happening. This is happening right now. If you don't feel confident enough to talk about it yourself, say, I've looked into this stuff, but here is this creator, here is this author, here is this spokesperson who is actually doing the work of explaining it. You don't have to be the educator. You don't have to be the one who is informed in every aspect of this. But if you know people who are doing this, if you understand that there are people who are putting the time and the effort in understanding this, go and share. And say, look at this person, go listen to what they're saying. It matters. What they're saying is very clear. It helps understand what is going on. Absolutely, share my information. Let people know that I'm talking about this. Give them that information and saying, look, here is this list of stuff that you can go and you can watch, or you can listen to, or you can visit with this individual and you can talk about this. But also, go out there, use your social media to promote this. Use whatever social media platform that you use for sharing memes and updating people on life statuses, and share that this stuff is happening. Tell people in all of your social circles to wake the hell up and listen to what is happening. Write into your local newspapers. Write a letter to the editor. Call in to radio shows. Do the things that the right has been doing all along. Use the platforms that are already out there. If you blog, blog it. Let people read this stuff. If you have a newspaper, write a letter to the editor. It doesn't matter how big or how small the paper is. Write a letter to the editor and let them know this is the stuff that's happening. If you're in a Discord, share this information with your Discord. Anywhere that you're in a conversation, talk about this. Anywhere that you're in a conversation, let people know this is what is happening. Let people know that you have had your eyes open, and you would hope that they would see it also. Contact your legislators. Contact your political leaders. But be specific. Tell them what you expect of them. Right now, stop asking for them to vote no on a bill, because they've already been bought and paid for. Start writing to people in legislatures at every level of politics and say, stop using dehumanizing language. You are violating the law. You are demeaning the character of a group of people who are your constituents. And you are less than a person of quality character. Let them know that you cannot get away with using language such as pedophile against somebody who has never been investigated, charged, or convicted for that crime. Tell them right up front that if they use that language, that you will continue to write to the ethics commissions, that you will continue to write to legal organizations, that you will continue to write to people to stop that language happening in the halls of our power as citizens of the United States. Write very specifically on what the stages, the process of genocide is. When somebody wants to write off on a bill, tell them exactly what kind of discrimination, what kind of dehumanization, how they are polarizing, how they are persecuting. Be specific. Inform yourself. Learn enough of the language to write to somebody and say, this is what you are doing. Write to the United Nations and demand more from them and say, look, you are overlooking this. You are not talking about this. You are not calling the United States government to account for an atrocity that is in the making. Do something about this. Write the UN Security Council. Get in touch with different human rights groups, the ACLU. Start talking with them and find out what you can do in your own local level. The ACLU is in every state in the United States. Reach out to your local chapter of the ACLU and find out what can you do. They need volunteers. Connect with your local groups, PFLAG, Free Mom Hugs, different organizations like that are doing everything they can to support transgender members in this time. So do what you can. Give your time. Volunteer. Give a little bit of effort. Maybe they just need someone to give hugs during Pride, during different events. Take the effort and put it into action. Don't just wait for somebody else to ask you. Be proactive. Go and ask, what can I do? Go and ask, how can I help the community? PFLAG is one of the ones that I have gotten to know in my local area. But Free Mom Hugs is also in my area. If there is a local community center, that supports LGBTQ youth, volunteer your time. Give them a sense of you're not alone. There are people who care about you. Take those steps to, basically give transgender people a sense of belonging, of connection, because many of us don't get that. Many of us don't feel like we're connected. Many of us don't feel like we have a community. Sometimes we can't feel that. Sometimes we can't make a connection with a community because of something that we are struggling with. So, gently and with consent, form a community with those people. I want to return to something that Dr. Gregory Stanton wrote. All people grow up and live in particular cultures, speaking particular languages, and they identify some people as us and others as them. This fundamental first stage in the process does not necessarily lead to genocide. Genocide only becomes possible with another common human tendency, considering only our group as human and dehumanizing the others. We create cultural boundaries that shut other groups out and may become the boundaries where solidarity ends and hatred begins. Ask yourself, what groups are you a part of that have boundaries that do not include transgender people? Look around you. You're a part of some. You are a part of different organizations, different groups, different social connections and networks and circles. You're a part of different cliques. If you are a part of something like that, demand a change. Demand that transgender people be included. Be the advocate. Be the one who is opening those boundaries to include transgender people. And if you have a group that does not want to open its boundaries to accept transgender people, then you get your ass away from them. Quite honestly, most of the churches in America that I know will not open their boundaries. They may do it in talk, but they will not do it in truth. They will do it in saying, oh yes, we definitely want transgender people here to hear the good news. But then they will turn around and they will tell that person, you're not good enough to actually be here, so you need to give up what you're doing. That's boundary. That is creating a boundary that says you're not really wanted unless you become like one of us. Break down boundaries to groups that you are a part of. And if they will not break those boundaries down, then leave. Do not associate, do not contribute, do not finance, do not in any way make that group better through your effort. If you want to be an ally, if you want to be a part of preventing the process of genocide, it is time to give up any associations that you have that would exclude or even continue to dehumanize transgender people. How do you do that? First of all, if they're telling jokes that include transgender people as the punchline, say something. If they are mocking transgender people or they are mocking people with transgender terms, stop them. Speak up. If they are in a position of where they can somehow promote any type of anti-transgender rhetoric, speak against it, completely against it. Do not let them have the floor. Do not let them have any type of free access. And by free access, let me say this. Free access doesn't mean that they have to pay to get it done. Sometimes it costs them to get it done, meaning that you make them pay. You get loud, you get in their face, and you tell them to shut their mouths. That is making them pay. Quite honestly, we are in this position of saying, you know, if we're going to be talked about in certain circles and you're a part of those circles, you are either with us or you are against us. If you are a part of groups that speak anti-trans rhetoric against us and you continue to associate with those groups, then you cannot associate with us. I've never asked people to participate in a boycott. That's up to you how you use your money. I'm not going to tell you how to use your money. But recognize that certain brands, certain companies, certain organizations do pay to create anti-trans rhetoric, legislation, and do what they can to disrupt transgender people living happy lives. If you are okay with giving money to efforts that would disrupt transgender people's lives, then that is for you to decide. But inform yourself about the companies that are doing that. Inform yourself about the organizations that are doing that. At least find out so you know where your money is going. At least find out, you know, is this money going to be used in such a way that agrees with what I agree with? We have to reassert, and this is again Dr. Gregory Stanton, we have to reassert our common humanity. We have to bring people together. The idea of our group is the right group, or our group is the best group, or our group has the right way of doing things needs to end. We are all human beings. We are all in a space of reaching out and touching the life of someone else, even if that someone else is different. We are all in a place where we can make a difference in the life of someone else if we would just do the job. And in doing the job, we begin to step into a place where classification and polarization would disappear. When we begin to treat others as the same, when we begin to see others not with fear, but with compassion, when we begin to see others not with protecting our own and scarcity mentality, and instead look at people with kindness and an abundance mentality, then we begin to change dehumanization. We do make the effort. We do something different. But if you don't want to make the effort, then don't ask what you can do. Because it's up to you to do something. It's up to you to make the effort. If you go out and you look up, how do we stop genocide? It's all at the big levels. It's policy. It's national interventions. It's international interventions. It's military interventions. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you all practical, everyday things that you can do to just get in the way of some of this shit. Most of us feel like this is overwhelming. You know what? It is overwhelming. It is overwhelming. And you know why it's overwhelming? Because it is a monumental task to step in the path of a genocide. There are juggernauts that are working behind the scenes to make this happen. Well, quite honestly, sometimes you can't get in the path of a juggernaut because it'll run you over. But if everybody grabs a little bit of the tail, we can definitely slow it down. And if there's enough of us, we can stop it. If we erode the everyday steps that are happening and take away the power of the everyday steps, then the juggernaut is going to slow. It will slow down. Eventually, it may even stop. But you have to be willing to make the effort. Not waiting for somebody else to tell you, ask you to do it. We've been asking. The transgender community has been asking for 3 years. We've been asking you to help. Now it's up to you to decide if you're going to. It's up to you to decide, will you make the effort? I've given you ideas. If you've not gotten any of these, when it goes to YouTube, watch it. Watch what watch it again, listen again, and hear what you could possibly do. Find something that fits your level of activity, your level of effort. There is something everyone can do. There is something that everyone can accomplish in trying to stop this. But if we continue to overlook the reality of it, if we continue to overlook that this is occurring right now on the soil of the United States, then we are participating in it. To deny that it is happening, to stick our head in the sand and say, well, I don't necessarily agree with all that, that is to participate in the effort. That is to participate in denial that genocide is happening. And I'm going to tell you right now, if we keep going, we're going to see these two things happen in wide scale. We're going to see persecution and extermination happen in wide scale swaths. The extermination of transgender people will happen if it continues. This is a process that has been moving. A process that is getting us to the place of where persecution and extermination are going to happen. And I don't want you to live with the regret of that. I don't want you to live with that sense of, I wish I'd have known this was happening. Well, I'm telling you it's happening. I wish I could have done something. You can do something. And I don't want you to have to live with the regret of, once this persecution and extermination has begun, to live with the regret of saying, I should have. You don't have to. You don't have to live with that regret. You don't have to live with that shame or that guilt. All you have to do is start taking the effort. I'm going to open the floor up for conversation, and